Welcome to Mom Alternative, where we react to some of the craziness in the mum sphere. Today, amongst other things, we will cover how to respond if your mother-in-law says, "Stop touching my grandson," how to navigate the conversation about future kids with your spouse, and how to deal with feelings of regret after a frenectomy. So the first one is titled, "Stop Touching My Grandson." Just a little vent. I'm getting nervous that my mother-in-law, who I typically have a really good relationship with, is going to become possessive over my baby. I'm 32 weeks with our rainbow baby boy, and it's true, I can't keep my hands off of my bump. Every time she sees me touching it, she tells me to stop touching my belly because it makes her jealous that I can hold him and she can't. I let her touch my belly too. I guess she's talking about the ability to carry my own child in my stomach. It makes me feel so weird, and I hope it's not an indication of what's to come when he arrives. She had 4 children of her own, for crying out loud. Let me enjoy my pregnancy. Why are they like this? This is probably one of the funniest titles I've read in a long time, and I am still a little bit shocked that she is referring to her grandson who is still in her belly, in her daughter-in-law's belly. So when I first read it, assumed that this was already like a born child that she could interact with as a grandmother, but that is clearly not the case. And so that makes it extremely strange as a statement. I think if you want to be very charitable and give her the best possible benefit of the doubt, where you say, okay, we're going to assume good faith and assume that she doesn't mean anything strange or possessive or annoying by it, then it would be the kind of statement that you make in jest. I guess it's not meant to be taken seriously. It's meant to be a joke. It's meant to be funny. It's just a way to express, hey, I'm really excited for the baby to be born. That's one interpretation that I guess if you're being very charitable, you could give her. I think what makes it hard for me to assume that this is what's happening here is the fact that she says every time she sees me touching my bump, she tells me to stop touching my belly because it makes her jealous. Something about that statement makes it sound like she actually means it. And if that is the case, then this is a very, very weird thing to say to a mother touching her own pregnant belly, which is technically herself and not the grandson, because the grandson is still inside. And even if that was the case and she was just constantly holding her baby, then she's the mother. This is completely within her rights to do that. It's such a mind-bogglingly strange, out of nowhere statement that I would honestly struggle to react to it in the moment. And if it became something that was said repeatedly, I would probably say, hey, I guess you don't mean that seriously, but it's getting kind of annoying now. Please stop. And if that didn't work, then I would probably actually ask my husband to talk to her, because that's not, it's just, there are some statements that just get annoying if you hear them long enough. And this is definitely one of those that's just there to make you feel weird about yourself and a little bit self-conscious and a little bit strange. So this is a completely out there statement. I find it a little bit funny. That's the part of me that's a little bit far and distant from this kind of interaction with your mother-in-law. I find it a little bit amusing, but if I were in that situation, I would probably lose my patience with it after maybe the second or third time that was said. Because honestly, when I was pregnant and I had my hands on my belly, it was also just natural because the belly was just there. It was very, very visible and very in the way all the time. So you kind of just rest your arms on it, right? That's a completely normal way of interacting with a pregnant belly. What is super nice here, as she says, I let her touch my belly too. So it sounds to me like she's actually really kind and open, and generally speaking, she's quite comfortable with her mother-in-law. So that makes it a little bit sad even, because, a great response if she's like, hey, don't stop touching my grandson because I'm jealous. And then you can respond with, oh, that's okay, you can come over and touch too. Then that's awesome. That's such a nice thing to say. It wouldn't even occur to me to say that, to be honest. But that's like the best case scenario for the mother-in-law in that situation. Otherwise, it's just very out there. Now you'll see a lot of people in the comments are also like, this is weird, very uncomfortable. First person here says, I'd see this for the red flag that it is. She's going to be incredibly overbearing, possessive, and jealous once the baby is here. It's one thing to feel a bit jealous, but for her to be so bothered that she actually articulated it, look out. This one is going to be a bit crazy. Be prepared. My in-laws acted pretty disinterested in my pregnancy, but then wanted to be over-involved, and my mother-in-law sincerely thought she was going to take over and play mum. It didn't happen. I was lucky in that I saw the red flag in how they acted with my stepdaughter and prepared myself with strong boundaries and a plan. I hope you are assertive, because she plans to majorly baby hog with comments like that. Now, I would kind of hope that if she has a pretty decent relationship with her mother-in-law, then that's not necessarily going to be the case. But yeah, I mean, who knows, right? There's a lot of missing context here. So it's very possible that there's other behavior or other red flags that would make you think, okay, maybe there is going to be a problem here. And in those cases, then I would still involve my husband first, because he can handle his mother. Some other comments. My body and my baby. It is my body and my baby, so I will do as I wish. Comments like that are making me uncomfortable. If she doesn't back down, then she needs a time out. And then the next person says, I tell her that you plan on holding your baby as much as you want. Thank you very much. Inside and outside the womb. And so, yeah, that's definitely part of it. It's sometimes I think people say things just because they have no filter, and then they don't quite realize or register exactly how that comes across to the person that's on the other end. This is definitely one of those situations. It's especially strange in the sense that if she's had 4 kids of her own, then she's had quite a lot of experience being pregnant. She has lived through her experience, the experience of having kids multiple times. So she knows what it's like. I don't know why you would ever say that. It's definitely one of those ways, as if you are trying to create bad will in seemingly a relationship that is already working out, which is totally unnecessary, and it's not a great time to do that when someone is pregnant. Our next thread is titled, Would you end it? Would you end your relationship if you couldn't agree on whether to have more kids or not? We just had our first in February and we love our adorable little one so much, but becoming parents has been the hardest thing we have ever faced. Baby was colicky, I was suffering so much depression, feeling like I was left to do everything alone. We were fighting like crazy the first couple of months after baby. It's getting better, but we aren't the affectionate couple we used to be, and I'm so sad about it. He says he never wants any more kids, but I still want to experience pregnancy again in the future and would love to give our baby a sibling. It's not a rush at all, but he's saying his opinion so matter of fact, like it's never happening again. He made a little joke or remark about how, quote, he's never dealing with my pregnant again. And I know he said it in a joking manner, but he's really not joking, and it actually really hurt my feelings. And I've been thinking about it a lot. Is this something worth ending a relationship over? So I'm going to respond to this one in 2 different ways. On the one hand, would you end your relationship over disagreeing about the number of kids that you want to have? And on the other hand, what OP should do here? So what OP should do, I think, so this was posted in June, and she says that they had their baby in February. So their baby is like 3-4 months old. That's a really short period of time. That is a short enough period of time that I would argue it's quite difficult to be able to make any long-term decisions about having babies or not. Although I say this, I'm one person who had my baby, and then a week later I was like, I'm ready for the second one, which is not because it was so easy having a baby, but because I enjoyed the experience so much that I kind of wanted to relive it. And I was a bit sad that the whole pregnancy birth experience was over so quickly. That was my personal experience. However, I think for the majority of people, if you're struggling, and especially if having a baby changed your relationship so much that you're having a lot of arguments and you haven't really quite settled in and found your groove yet as parents, then I think it's just too soon and a little bit too early to be making any drastic decisions about whether you should be staying in this relationship in the long run or not. So if I were OP, I would wait a much longer period of time. That's one part to it. The other part to it is, I think that their communication in this relationship is not going super well. When she says here, he made a little joke or remark about how he's never dealing with my pregnant. But again, I would probably say that that's a very clear sign that maybe there was a lot of conflict throughout the pregnancy as well. And neither of them are quite over exactly what that experience did to their relationship and how they interacted with each other. The fact that this hurt her feelings, I would probably address that. And I think I would probably have a serious conversation about pregnancy, how the pregnancy was managed, how the first few months went, and what you would want to do differently in future if possible. Because every pregnancy is different and every child is different, but maybe as some kind of foundation that within your relationship you're on more solid ground before you start mixing things up with adding more kids into the mix. That's how I would approach this. I don't think I would already start considering ending my relationship over it unless there were way bigger problems happening here. That's what I would do if I were OP. With regards to the actual question, I think it's a really, really interesting question. I personally would probably say it depends to what extent, like how big of a gap is there, and who is not willing to compromise, or how did you end up in a position where neither party is really able or willing to compromise? And I think that that's kind of where the crux of the matter is. So let's say if I want to have 5 kids and my husband wants to have 1 child, then that's such a huge, major difference in expectations that I would probably question, how did we get to this point where we disagree to such a large extent? And I find it kind of hard to imagine that if you disagree to a huge extent about the number of kids that you want to have, then can you really agree on all other values that are really relevant and important and major for you? As an example, a lot of people will say that the maximum number of kids that they want to have are 2. And their explanation will be something along the lines of overpopulation. If we have 2 children, then we're just replacing ourselves in the great scheme of things when it comes to population. Therefore, that's okay. Now, to me, this type of reasoning is so far away from anything that I could comprehend or agree with that I would question, how am I on the same page with my husband if this is how he's thinking? Does that make sense? So I think to some extent, the reason for the refusal makes a lot of sense. Now, a lot of people will say something along the lines of, hey, it's because the person who does not want to have kids is the one that decides. Like, the deciding factor is not wanting to have kids, because if the other person wants kids, then it's too bad. You can't force kids on a human being. It's like, yes, of course, you can't force kids on a human being. It is completely within both parties' rights to say, we have absolutely no interest, or I have absolutely no interest in having more children. And that's completely fine. But if there is such a major difference, then I would just question, can you be possibly happy as a couple in the future? Now, when it comes to would you end it, I would probably seriously consider it under 2 circumstances. If the difference is really huge, so if it's something like I want 3 kids, he wants 2 kids, and then we settle on 2, then I'm fine with that. That's not a big deal. But if the difference is very big, then that's a major source of conflict. And if there was really no way to compromise, no way to change it, if the other person is really so strong in their perspective that there's no way to move towards each other, because I would say that if you cannot compromise on this, and this is a really major problem, and I think I would also most likely consider how many kids you already have. So if it's just 1 child, which I assume is the point at which you would have this disagreement, if it's just 1 child, as if having 1 child is a little thing, it's not, it's a huge thing. But would I end a marriage that has lasted 20, 30 years, where we've already had, 3 kids, because I want 1 more and he doesn't want 1 more? Then probably not. So I think there's a lot of factors there that kind of come into play. This one, it sounds like it's pretty important to OP to have at least 1 other kid. But yeah, maybe work on your relationship first and try to get on the same page and try to build a deeper sense of connection and a deeper understanding of each other and your wants and needs before you make any decisions here. So I would appreciate this. Now, a lot of people actually say something similar along the lines of, okay, people say things in relationships, especially early on, and especially when you haven't had kids before, where you can kind of sit there and be like, oh yeah, it'd be amazing to have 4 kids. And then you have your first child and you're like, oh my God, this is a lot. I don't think I can handle anymore. So yes, people do say things early on in the relationship that maybe in hindsight they shouldn't have said. And so that's kind of where a lot of people come at this type of question from. So this person says, I wouldn't make any decisions right now. I knew I wanted a second, and my husband was very clear that he was done. We agreed to wait until our son was 2 years old to discuss it. Now my son is 2 and I'm pregnant with the second child. So it seems that the husband here changed his mind. This one replies, I would end the relationship over this. I'm on the opposite end with you though. We discussed we wanted to have at least 2. This was a deal breaker for him after 12 years trying to conceive, multiple miscarriages, 2 ectopic pregnancies, and a high-risk pregnancy, and a complicated birth. I do not want any more children. My husband and I were at an impasse for weeks until he told me that he is willing to leave me to have more children with someone else. I was definitely hurt, but I have to respect and accept that he wants more children, and I do not. I told him that I was okay with his decision to do whatever makes him happy. He regretted his ultimatum and took it back. We're still together and have not discussed having more children since. I'm only 17 weeks postpartum, so I may change my mind in the future, but I will not stay with someone that does not respect my mental and physical health for their own happiness. For me, it was due to my physical health concerns, but for fathers, I could see it would be mental health. We can't really force them to have more children and be happy about it if they didn't want to in the first place. And that's exactly the case. Like, it's a pretty toxic environment to bring a child into. If one of the parents is really like, I did not want this kid, then that's not good. If you decide to have kids, then it should be a mutual decision under all circumstances. And that's kind of the part where it's like, okay, if you are not able to compromise on it, then where would you go from there? OP says, which I think is a pretty rough comment, she says, the thing is, I'm the only one who's been doing all the hands-on parenting, and he does work a lot. So honestly, his life wouldn't change all that much with another kid, except maybe financially. Maybe that's why I have a hard time wrapping my head around it all. I think that's a pretty terrible attitude, both in terms of excusing the fact that he's maybe not as hands-on as he should be as a father, and saying, well, it's not that big of a deal for him. I'll be the one doing all the work anyway. That's not a good attitude to have when it comes to choosing to have more kids. Definitely, there's a lot more that goes into it, and it's not a question of finances. And if you're approaching it from the side of, oh, well, it's just a little bit of extra money that he has to spend, then the father-kid relationship that's happening here is a terrible one, and you should really be changing that. The final comment that I would read here is from this person, and she says, I wouldn't have married my husband if I was willing to leave him over the amount of children we do or don't have. So no, I wouldn't. And that's pretty cool. Like, I find it kind of awesome that there are people like this who say, hey, this is not a deal breaker for me. I kind of, on some level, compare it a little bit to the idea of sex in marriage. And so if you end up as a wife saying, hey, look, you know what, I never want to have sex ever again, then as a husband, or vice versa, it doesn't matter which spouse says this. But if you make that as a decision, of course, it's completely 100% within your rights to decide that for yourself. But then it means that there's a foundation in your relationship that's really damaged. And that's a problem. And how do you work past that without one of you compromising is really difficult for me to imagine. So I think fundamentally compromise is important, including when it comes to the number of kids that you have. But maybe this is one of those conversations that you should also have early on. And maybe it's also largely influenced by the types of backgrounds that people come into a relationship with and so on. So whether they had lots of siblings or not. Thankfully, me and my husband are on the same page when it comes to the number of kids that we want to have. And so that is the ideal. That is what I would suggest that everyone try to find and agree on as soon as possible. Our next thread is titled Frenectomy, Horrible Mother. We had an upper lip tie and tongue tie surgically addressed for our baby this week, and I can't shake the feeling of regret and feeling like it was the wrong choice. The consult felt like just being pushed into the procedure, and I feel like I've seen no marked improvement since then. Although I was told he may have ties a couple of weeks ago and did a ton of research on the procedure and everything, I felt relatively knowledgeable about the symptoms and treatments. When we got to the appointment, the dentist gave me a check sheet a checklist, I guess, to fill out with varying statements. Does baby have trouble latching or staying latched? Are your nipples misshaped or blanched during feeding? Does baby fuss at breast or bottle? Does baby chew or gum your nipple? Does he seem hungry all the time? Does he have colic or is he irritable? These are just a few examples I remember, but I nearly checked off the entire sheet in terms of the problems baby and myself were having. Anyone else? I'm just mad at myself for not taking more time to think it through and caving to the dentist's pressure to have it done. My husband and I discussed whether to do the procedure before we signed paperwork, but it still felt rushed. I also feel like a horrible mother for putting my child through such a procedure. I spoke with another mum whose child is a bit older than mine, and she said the dentist recommended not to do the frenectomy, but to try body work instead. We didn't see the same dentist. Am I a crappy mum for putting my child through such an ordeal? Now, this is one that is quite complicated on a number of levels. I'm going to start by saying a frenectomy is a procedure that's quite common nowadays, unfortunately, in babies, where if you say there is a little piece of flesh that attaches your lip to your gums on the top, and on the bottom there's also a little piece of flesh that attaches your tongue to the bottom of your tongue. That I'm pretty sure everyone knows what I mean. That is sometimes referred to as a tongue tie or a lip tie or a cheek tie. You have them on the sides here as well. And sometimes nowadays, when babies have problems with latching, one of the potential causes of those issues might be that their tongue ties are a little bit too short, so their lip ties or their cheek ties or whatever it is, so that they don't have quite the same level of mobility that you would want them to have in their oral cavity that they need to have in order to be able to nurse properly. This is one potential symptom or way of seeing that there might be a problem with regards to that. The other way in which that manifests itself are speech impediments when kids are a little bit older, and then they have a hard time saying things the way that they should be able, and pronouncing things the way that they should be able to say them, just because they don't have the same level of mobility in their oral cavity. So that's what this is. A lot of people have them those surgically snipped, and that will mean that that piece of flesh is not holding anything there anymore, so that kids can relearn how to use their mouths. Now, I think it's a completely separate question. The way that I read this thread would be to say that there's a very different question here, whether this is the correct procedure for your child or not. That is one aspect of it. And that is something that only every mother and child and doctor can decide on the basis of that particular individual child. That is not something, I say mother, also parents, not just the mother. But this is something individual, and you can only do that on the basis of a consultation with an expert who really knows what they're talking about and having a proper in-depth conversation. What I think is very clear from this thread is the way in which the medical establishment interacts with parents and interacts with people in general, patients. And that is where I would argue the biggest source of regret for this mum is coming from. So when she says, hey, I'm mad at myself for not taking more time to think it through and caving to the dentist's pressure to have it done. So what that says to me is that she ultimately does not feel like she had a proper consultation. They did not, as a couple, they didn't actually sit down with the dentist and have a full, comprehensive, detailed explanation of what the procedure meant for their child, why it was necessary to do, what the risks of not having it done would have been, what alternatives they may have had as parents if they didn't want to get it done. It sounds to me like that whole conversation was just lacking. And the experience that she had from her interaction with the doctor was that he gave her a piece of paper. He said, yeah, just look through it. And when she said, yeah, okay, I do experience quite a lot of these symptoms, then he just went, cool, great, then we should get it done. And there was pressure there, and it wasn't a considered decision. And this is one of those circumstances that I think as a parent, you have the opportunity to either make a really great decision or make at least what you can confidently stand behind and say, that was the best possible decision that I could have made at that time, because I really invested all the time that I could in getting all the information that was necessary and getting the advice that was necessary to make the best decision for my child. So there's that way that you could walk out of this type of consultation, have that feeling. The other way is what she has, where you go, hey, you know what? I'm not actually sure that went all that great, and maybe this was a mistake. Now, it's possible that you still make a mistake for your child. The decision ultimately does not help at all with any of the symptoms that they're experiencing, that it was not the correct decision for them, but you still invested all of the time in making the best possible decision. As far as I can tell, she did not invest that time, and that's why she feels that sense of regret. And that, I think, is a really major problem in medicine today, because this is not just the case for parents who make decisions for their kids, but it's also the case for mothers during the whole pregnancy, labor, birth experience. It is also the case for anyone who experiences any kind of illness. It is very possible that you end up with one of those doctors who, again, assuming good faith, let's say they are totally dedicated to making you as healthy as possible. They just want to help you. But also, they've been doing this job for 20, 30 years. It's kind of repetitive. They see the same types of cases over and over and over again. They've lost the ability to engage with you as an individual and to treat you as a unique person. And this happens all the time in the medical establishment. Like, this is just a pretty common way that people have of just dealing with it. It becomes routine. Whenever something becomes routine, then you stop engaging on the same level as you did when it was new and fresh. And so, as anyone making any type of medical decision, Robin Thompson of the Thompson method will always say, you should always ask, what are the benefits of this procedure? What are the risks of having it done? And what are the alternatives that are available? And if you know those three things, then you can, at the very least, make an informed decision and stand behind it. And this is 50 million times as important when you're making decisions for your kids or when you're making decisions for any other dependent who cannot decide for themselves, because then you can really do damage to someone else by accident without intending it, despite having the best of intentions. And I think that that's a regret that's really hard to get over. So that's what I would say to OP here. I think that essentially the lesson that she needs to take from this, or the lesson that I would take from this experience, is that I will never allow myself to be pressured to make any kind of medical decision for my child in future. And if I'm talking to a doctor who I think is treating me like that, then I will not be taking any of their advice seriously. I will go find a different doctor and get another opinion and try to inform myself a lot better before I go along with it. And then the hope is that at the end of it, even if I make a mistake, I can genuinely believe that I did my best as a mother to make the best decision for my child. A lot of people respond very differently to this because they take the frenectomy as the medical decision in and of itself. And then they go, hey, no, this was a great decision. I had it done for my child and it really, really helped us. So probably it was the best decision for you as well. Here's an example. For me, that checklist was the most reassurance that I was doing the right thing. I was also a little hesitant. Baby was gaining weight. We were exclusively breastfed. She was just a bit fussy. It was missed by multiple people. So was it really that bad? Then as the dentist went through each symptom and I said yes to all of them, I realized that it maybe doesn't have to be this difficult. We are 1 week out and haven't seen drastic improvement, but a few feeds have been significantly better. I still get really frustrated. It seems like nothing has changed, but I'm trying to be patient. All that to say, you are not a bad mom. This is a difficult road dealing with ties, and it sounds like you did a lot of research. I hope now that it's been a little longer, you're feeling more confident in your decision. And so to that, I think that this association of, okay, if I make this decision, am I a bad mom? Then this is not a constructive or not a helpful way of looking at the situation. Maybe you made a mistake. And maybe if you learn from that mistake, you can be a better mom in future, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are a bad mom. As you can see, though, sometimes people are really like on the fence where they go, I'm not sure. I guess we'll see how it goes. This comment is the opposite. This person says, when my last baby was a few weeks old, I went to a lactation consultant. She told me to try clipping for a tie. I told her that we'll wait and see what a few more weeks looked like before resulting to that. Feeding significantly improved in the coming days. Baby was still learning and so was I. 4 years later, I realized we never needed it. I think there are babies that truly might need it, but I also feel like this solution is just thrown out there as an easy response. I hate to say that, but it's true. Regardless, it's already done and I'm sure everything will be all right. Just keep moving forward. And so that's a perfect example of why, as a parent, you should really inform yourself. You should really understand what the potential negative consequences might be and what the positive consequences that you are hoping for look like before you make any decisions. But there's no point in rehashing the same decision over and over again. I really think that this is the biggest thing that you can take from it is say, okay, what are the lessons that I can learn from this, so I can, in theory, if I were to go through the same situation again, I would make a better choice this time, or at least a choice that I feel better about. And the final comment that I'll read is from this person. She says, oh my God, you poor love to be feeling this way. As you can tell, I find this way of talking to people a little bit condescending. And it does not appeal to me, but here we are. She says, it's so best to get it done sooner rather than later, as it can have serious implications on feeding and a lot of pain for you now and speech issues or with eating later on. Babies really don't feel it when they're tiny. There's basically no nerves there for them to feel it. It's honestly no worse for them than getting jabs done. My little one had his tongue tie released and it definitely looked worse than it was because of the blood. Anecdotally, my husband, who was bottle fed, had to undergo general anesthetic when he was 5 to release his tongue tie, which is obviously much worse than a small baby snip. Make sure you stick to the exercises they prescribed, and please don't feel bad. You've done something necessary to help your baby thrive. And these types of comments, not only because of the statement at the beginning, but these types of comments really grind my gears. They're the ones that make me really angry. So you cannot, as an external person on the internet, know or be able to tell whether this was the right decision for this child or not. And the reassurance of, oh, no, of course you had to do it, is a terrible one and can be really, really harmful. And then the claim, babies really don't feel it when they're tiny. There's basically no nerves there for them to feel it. There are a lot of babies who are in quite a lot of pain as a result of this procedure. For a very, very, very long time, unfortunately, we believed that babies just don't feel pain because, I don't know, they're babies and they can't tell you that they feel pain. Even though clearly if you poke them with something sharp, they will cry. And if they scratch themselves, they will cry. Of course, they experience pain. But for a very long time, we treated it as if because they're so small, they won't experience, they just can't tell that something has happened. And it's so much worse to do. Honestly, if you do it as a 5-year-old, then you do it because it's absolutely necessary for you. It's medically necessary for you. Whereas with a baby, there is a potential that it might not be medically necessary for you. And so those are two completely different scenarios. And the comparison is really unfair and really terrible. And yeah, I just wish that people did not have this laissez-faire attitude in terms of how they interact with their babies and in terms of the medical decisions that they make for their babies. And the claim that, they won't remember anyway, so it'll be fine, is a terrible one as well, which does come up in this thread. So there are very many reasons and there are very many ways that you can just make good decisions for your kids. And that isn't to say that you might not still make mistakes, and mistakes might happen. And of course, as a parent, you're always motivated by the best of intentions. But intentions are not enough if you don't do your due diligence and you don't take your responsibility as a parent seriously enough to make good decisions for your kids. Also, don't randomly pat people on the back who you don't know and who you know nothing about when they make decisions that may be wrong. That's not a good attitude either. Don't trust the internet if they try to do that. Our next thread is titled, Friend That Doesn't Like My Child. How do you handle friends that don't like your children? To be fair, she doesn't like any children, but it's still tough. She wants to spend time together, but only if my child isn't around. She won't visit us in our town where we have sitters we trust, but she expects us to travel to her where we have no sitters. She's also upset my husband and I can't drop over $4,000 to go to her destination wedding, and she blames our child that we can't go. Our child isn't even the reason. That's just a lot of money when we have other expenses and a vacation planned for next month already. It's beginning to become exhausting being her friend. Edited to add, the resort she picked is adults only, so I don't have the option of bringing my one-year-old. My child and I would be separated for a week, and I've only ever spent one night away from him so far. Now, as you probably won't be surprised to hear, pretty much I think 100% of the comments say something along the lines of, you should drop this friend. And clearly, this doesn't seem like the best possible friend that you could have. But I wanted to make a comment around, I think it's much harder. Somehow, maintaining friendships as a parent is a very different experience to maintaining friendships as someone who is either single or just not a parent. At least someone who is childless is just a very different person. The moment you have kids, then you have a very different type of responsibility to your kids than otherwise. And I think not only is it a little bit harder to relate to people just because, say, for example, my day-to-day is very much involved with our baby. And so quite a lot of, like, if someone asks, hey, how are you doing? Then not only will I say how I'm doing, but very often I'll also say how my baby's doing, because how he's doing reflects a lot on how I'm doing and vice versa. And I can totally get that if you don't have kids, you kind of don't really care, and having that conversation happen all the time around you might be a bit like, well, this is just not, it's just not meshing with me. So I think that some aspect of distancing yourself a little bit from friends that you may have had before you had kids, after you have kids, kind of happens a little bit naturally, just because people are just not on the same level, and the conversations that they have, the interests that they have, can't really be the same anymore for a lot of people. So some aspect of it is pretty normal. The part here that I think is absolutely not normal is that this is a very entitled friend. I don't even know, like, the moment you find yourself saying a statement like, it's beginning to become exhausting being her friend, like, I just wouldn't be friends with someone who is tiring to deal with. I don't know why people do this to themselves. I don't know how you ended up even having a conversation around, hey, it's gonna cost $4,000 to come to my wedding, and I expect you to come and spend a week there and dump your kid because I don't like your kid, and I don't care. I just don't know who would ever want to be friends with a person like this, and how you ended up in this place where this is even a conversation or even a thought that went through your head. Because if I had a friend who said that to me, I'd kind of be like, cool, bye. Like, I don't need to interact with you anymore. My friendship, my time is worth so much more than this. So yeah, I when it comes to how do you handle friends that don't like your children, I think that might be a bit of a deeper question that you can go into. This particular situation is a pretty clear-cut one where I'd say just cut the friend out. There's no point in investing time here. But in general, if you have friends that don't like your children, my first question would be, is there a reason they don't like your children? And is that because you are lacking as a parent in some kind of way? Or there's a problem that you need to handle as a parent? Because generally speaking, most people don't like children when there are issues. So if they're rowdy, if they throw tantrums, if they're violent, if they're aggressive, if they're sore losers and not fun to play with, those are the types of reasons that most adults would dislike children. If it's just someone who's like, yeah, I just can't handle being around children, then I would probably say, yeah, well, then too bad. Like, I have a kid now. My kid is going to be with me, and I would much rather spend time with my kid than spend it with anyone else. Some examples of the responses. One person says, I'd message her and let her know not only is she ridiculous, but she isn't in line with your life anymore. I'd say, sorry, can't be friends with someone who constantly complains about my child and me not wanting to be away from my child. Hope you have a good life. And that would be it. Yeah. Pretty simple to end relationships, honestly, to end friendships. You just kind of stop replying. Next person says, she sounds like a selfish, entitled brat. I have dropped friends in the past when I realized that I felt more drained than energized with them in my life, and I have no regrets. I find that the older I get, the smaller my group got, and now I have 10 very close friends of 10 to 35-year friendships, and those are my friends that I will always have and love dearly. People and friendships change. It's okay to walk away, and I would encourage it if this is how she treats you. Yeah, I do think that if you spend a lot of time with people in your life who are just negative and who cause that negativity in your life, then it's not good. It's not healthy for you. It's not the best possible environment for you. And I wouldn't surround myself with it either. Our next thread is titled, Pregnancy is Glorified. Hello, I'm B. I just wanted to come on here and see if anyone else felt this way, because I am so tired of pretending that I am happy being pregnant. I absolutely hate it. This is my first pregnancy. I'm 11 weeks, 6 days today, and I am hating every minute of it. My husband is in the military, and he literally knocked me up, moved me to Japan in the span of 1 month, and left this entire first trimester, and still won't be back till July. This was posted in June, by the way. Little to no contact is how it's been. I honestly just feel like venting in case any other expecting mamas out there are on the same boat. I'm alone and in a different country and completely out of my element. I was diagnosed with hyperemesis gravidarum at 8 weeks, which led me to the ER alone for 4 days, and that was kind of traumatic for me. Hyperemesis gravidarum is essentially very extreme morning sickness. I suffer from severe anxiety and OCD, and one of my obsessive fears is hospitals. I.e. going in and never coming out, essentially. But this has been the hardest thing I've done in my entire life. I feel so unhappy And being off my meds involuntarily because I couldn't keep anything down, including Zoloft and prenatals, it seems impossible to reach those 9 months. I want this baby, don't get me wrong, but this constant, relentless nausea and throwing up, annoying anxiety is just really tearing me apart. And don't even get me started on tearing and labor fears I've acquired. I just want to know I'm not crazy for being so angry and unhappy during a time that should be celebrated. When I try to talk to other women who've had babies about how awful this is, a weird, similar monologue comes out their mouth. It's so worth it. Everyone goes through it. It's not so bad. You'll be okay. And that makes me hate myself more because it makes me feel weak for admitting that I am far from okay and the most miserable I've been in my life. As I type this, I'm literally holding in my puke, and it infuriates me that I'm no longer fully in control of my body. I've grown cold and detached from my baby because I literally feel like I'm in survival mode. Am I a terrible person? Should I even be a mother? Now, this is obviously a very, very, very sad thread in general. I want to address a whole bunch of different things here. The first one is the claim pregnancy is glorified. I actually disagree very much with the claim that pregnancy is glorified. I think there are way more horror stories like this about pregnancies that get shared than positives. I was terrified of the idea of being pregnant for pretty much, I'd also say most of my early 20s, pretty much all of my early 20s. When I was very young, I would always have this thought, hey, I kind of like the idea of kids, but being pregnant, labor, birth, none of that sounds super appealing. That sounds like an extremely painful and exhausting time. And I think that I developed that attitude pretty much through osmosis from my environment and from the people around me, and the way that media portrays pregnancy, the way that media portrays labor, and so on. So I disagree very fundamentally with this claim. When I was pregnant and I was around colleagues and so on, everyone would always very much enjoy telling me asking what types of symptoms I was experiencing, asking if morning sickness was really bad, asking if I had if I had back pain, if I could still walk, if I could still sit, how comfortable I was, how uncomfortable I was, etc., etc., etc. So a lot of people really focus on the negatives of pregnancy, and that is kind of the sucky for everyone out there who does not have a terrible pregnancy. And I was one of those people who had a pretty awesome pregnancy by and large. And so because I had a pretty awesome pregnancy, I cannot relate so much to this person on a personal level. What I think I would always try to emphasize when people have these types of experiences is how much of the experience, I would always question how much of this experience is due to the physicality, like the physical symptoms that you are going through, versus due to everything else around it. And I would always question, as a person who is suffering, who's going through a really painful experience, to what extent are there things that you can do that could influence it positively? For example, if you want to get pregnant, if you're actually actively trying to conceive, and would be a planned pregnancy, then for every mother out there, or for every prospective, for every hopeful mother out there, I would probably spend the first 6 months or a year before you start trying to get pregnant, really looking at nourishing yourself and your body and getting your physical health in the best possible shape that you could get it. And that involves doing things like eating very, very well, eating a lot of foods that are really high in vitamins. So things like liver, meat, oysters, fish, etc. Those types of things, like real diversity in your diet. And then looking at things like getting lots of sunlight, doing exercise, getting your sleep schedule in order, everything that you could possibly do that gets your body in the best possible physical shape that you can do it. Because a lot of sickness is down to the depletion, or the level of depletion that your body is experiencing. And the more depleted you are, the more exhausted you'll be, the harder of a time you will have, and so on. Morning sickness is often a symptom in early pregnancy specifically, because your body during that time is building up the placenta. And once the placenta is there, then the placenta takes on a lot of the energy that is required to sustain the baby. And that's why a lot of people will experience in their second trimester, but a lot of people call it like kind of the honeymoon of pregnancy. The second trimester gets so much better than the first trimester, because the first trimester, the baby is being fed. You're feeding both the baby and the placenta, and both of those are happening directly from your system, from your blood, from your body, without any support. So that's one thing that could help. In this situation, for example, OP, it sounds a lot like isolation is a really big problem, and not having help or support is the biggest issue that you are experiencing. So this is part of getting pregnant, then moving, then being in a foreign country where you don't have a support system, where you don't have connections, where you don't have family, where no one can help you, and then your partner, your husband is also not present, so he also can't help you. And so what happens is that you end up experiencing this life of just feeling sick all the time and being able to dwell in that sickness and not getting any support from anyone. So when you do feel a bit hungry, you have to go feed yourself. If you do want to clean up, you have to clean up by yourself. And that makes it so much more difficult. And so in general, if you have a support system, and look for ways to try and get yourself a support system, whether online, but ideally in person, because that will make a much bigger difference to your life. That can make a huge difference in these periods of time when you're just not feeling well and you just need some help. That's one aspect of it. When she says, okay, can't do anything about the nausea and the throwing up, and that's really unfortunate, that's a medical part. I would hope that her doctors can help her out with that. But the gnawing anxiety and the fear of tearing and labor fears, like these are all pretty typical horror stories that people share when it comes to pregnancy, labor, birth, etc. And those are all things that you can control as well to a large extent. So when it comes to fear of tearing and fear of labor, I would probably, as much as possible, try to surround yourself with positive birth stories that went well. I would try to educate myself about what's the real risk of tearing, what does that actually look like in practice, how many women suffer from it, how large of a problem is it, how damaging is it really, and what could I do as an individual that would reduce my chances of tearing, so that I can have the best possible birth and labor and have the best experience that I can have. Essentially, whatever you can do to try to support your body and to try to help yourself out will make a big difference when it comes to being in this mindset of, oh my God, this is such a terrible, terrible, terrible period of my life, and I just want it to be over. Yes, I completely understand having that feeling, and when you are seriously sick, when you have something like hyperemesis gravidarum, I can totally understand why you feel that way. And maybe dwelling in that feeling just a little bit will make a difference and is worth, maybe just venting and getting this emotion out there is good and will help you feel a little bit supported. But it's also really valuable to remember and to learn that there are usually some small ways that you can support yourself and support your body. This is not so bad. And so I say all of this for everyone out there who's really terrified of pregnancy, for everyone who's really terrified of the idea of giving birth, for everyone who thinks labor is, oh my God, the most painful thing that anyone could ever go through, and it's just so horrible, and all of this is a lot of suffering. For all of those people, I just want to put this out there. It does not have to be that way. And if you are one of those people who has a hard pregnancy or who has a hard labor, then reframing your mindset around it to at least try to make it as comfortable and as easy as possible for you in the ways that you can influence it will still make a big difference. Some of the comments here, one person says, I am pregnant again after a miscarriage. I'm happy I'm pregnant, but then again, I am not. I'm so incredibly miserable too. I can barely leave my bed. I'm nauseous and constipated and depressed and can't sleep since I need to pee every 15 minutes. I'm not enjoying food at all and constantly hungry. I'm around 8 weeks. This first trimester is hell. I feel bad too for complaining, but this sucks. You're not a terrible person. You'll be a great mother. Hang in there. It's hard to believe those words, but I hear it gets better after the first trimester. And this really is the case for the vast majority of people. The first trimester is the hardest. I feel a little bit sad for her that she feels dismissed when other people say, hey, it's really worth it. I think people will often say that and fall back to that as a response, because once you have gone through pregnancy and you have a baby, and suddenly having a baby is a really, really amazing experience. And that's the part that sticks in your head is much more memorable than the whole pregnancy and labor part before that. So I suppose that's one of the reasons why you might feel a little bit not heard from this. Another comment that I'll read out here. I had a relatively easy pregnancy and I hated being pregnant, giving up my entire body, puking for 12 weeks, having to work on top of feeling like crap, the worries and anxiety, the last few weeks and wondering how labor would go, etc. Oh my Lord, it was the most difficult thing on my body, mind and soul. So many women say they'll miss being pregnant and I'm like, how? I'm 10 days postpartum and so relieved to be on the other side. Taking care of my baby is so much easier than being pregnant. I know it's such a long road, but you're on it and there's your beautiful baby at the end of it and you're definitely not alone. I find this a really funny statement when people say things like, I had a relatively easy pregnancy, but I hated it. And here I would say, puking for 12 weeks is not a normal experience. Most people will maybe be sick a couple of times or will feel nauseous, but not actually be sick. So that I wouldn't put that under relatively easy pregnancy, but okay, I'm glad she feels that on the whole it was relatively easy. And then the rest of it, I would actually argue, is also largely either situational or mindset based. So this idea of I'm giving up my entire body, I think that's something that you tell yourself, that you feel in your head. Having to work on top of feeling like crap, like that's a situational one that is also really sucks, and I completely understand why it sucks. But I would question if maybe the reason it sucks is knowing that you have to do it and being forced to do it and not being able to say, hey, you know what, I'm just going to be out sick for a week or 2 weeks and until I feel a little bit better and then it's going to be different. That's one aspect of it. The worries and anxiety, wondering how labor would go. This is just everything is all about how you talk to yourself and the type of mindset that you get yourself into. And honestly, you don't have to feel that way or act that way when it comes to being pregnant. So for all the people out there who are really scared that this is going to be you, I'm not saying that it's not going to be you. No one knows how pregnancy will go until you're through it. And even if you've been through pregnancy before, every pregnancy is different and people have wildly different experiences from one pregnancy to the next. But under all circumstances, the narrative that you tell yourself in your head has a huge influence when it comes to how you feel about pregnancy in general and how the experience is for you on the whole and how you remember it. That's one aspect to it. And number two, there are always things that you can do to support yourself. The question is that the real struggle is in finding out what those things are and really trying to go after them. And then to end on a slightly happier note, our last thread of the day is titled Second Time Mums. Things that you found easier about having a baby than you expected to be. She says, 34 weeks pregnant and I need positive experiences since everyone seems to love to mention only the bad things about motherhood. And then she edited this afterwards and said, love your responses. You're all giving strength and positive vibes to all first-time moms. Reading your experiences, keep them coming. So this is, the opposite of the previous one that we just read, that you can see a little bit of the amount of fear and kind of worry that people have around pregnancy. And it doesn't have to be that way. So I'll read out the first response here. She says, labor, I really thought it was going to be a nightmare and I was so scared with my first. Yes, it's different for everyone, but from my personal experience, it was amazing. I'm here to say that it can be a wonderful, easy experience. She also says, breastfeeding, I was under the impression as a first-time mom that most women fail at it or they hate it. I felt like it was inevitable that I would end up pumping like everyone else I knew or giving formula, which I was totally okay with. However, I ended up nursing for 2.5 years. It came natural for me and I never had to supplement or pump. Also, this is weird, but I was really worried I couldn't change a diaper properly. It was way easier than I had imagined it was going to be. And added to add that the sleep deprivation isn't as bad as people make it out to be. Like, you're running on mummy fuel, you adapt yourself to the child's needs, and it really does become natural. So it's a good example of how quite a lot of the horror stories that you hear before giving birth, and this is the horror stories around having the baby and looking after the baby, end up not to be true, which I think is really sweet. And I would actually also agree to all of those. They're pretty much the same for me. Although I was never the type of person to worry quite so much. And that's why I find it a little bit easier to detach and to say, okay, you know what? I don't have to be in this spiral of, oh my God, this is going to be the worst thing ever. Next person also says, labor also for me was easier than expected. I was induced, and don't get me wrong, it wasn't a good time, but I'd rather give birth several times to skip pregnancy, she says. And postpartum for me was really good. My body felt decent afterwards, and I felt like I recovered very quickly. Every stage is going to have its moments, but it all goes by so quickly. This is quite amusing to me when it comes to, hey, I would rather give birth 3 times and skip pregnancy. Honestly, I think the primary difference is that birth does end quite quickly and pregnancy lasts a long time. So 9 months is a much, much longer time than, half a day or a day, however long you end up spending in labor. A day is already very, very long. Another one that I wanted to read, which I think is also something that a lot of people are scared about, is weight loss. She says, I was terrified that being pregnant would wreck my body since I was an older first-time mom and I'm very petite. I felt huge and hideous by the end of pregnancy and thought I'll never get back to where I was. 9 months of breastfeeding and eating whatever the heck I wanted and never working out once, and I was 10 pounds lighter than pre-pregnancy and looked better than I ever have in my life. I went through so much worry about that for nothing. And so, just to wrap up here with regards to how different people's perceptions and experiences can be, and how there's honestly usually a lot more positive than negative than people expect, because I would argue that the majority of people feel way more inclined to share negative experiences. No one goes, or very, very, very few people go on a forum like this and say, hey, you know what, I'm having a really easy pregnancy, because you're surrounded by all of the people who actually need help and who are asking for support, and coming out and saying, for me, everything is great, kind of sounds not the best move, and not very sympathetic and not very compassionate. So for all people out there who have any kind of fear associated with pregnancy, it does not have to be that way. If anyone disagrees with anything that I said about any of the threads that we read today, feel free to leave a comment and subscribe if you want more similar content. Have a great time.